Well, welcome to the Campus Earth curriculum here on the Grassroots Warrior Network. And class is in session with Matt Ehret today. We are going to do an historical deep dive on the American system of political economy. And I really think it's a topic that, well, I don't want to get too far ahead of myself because we should introduce Matt. We had Cynthia Chung on. That's his wonderful, beautiful wife. She graced us with her presence a couple of weeks back, and now we have the pleasure to bring on her husband. They're the co-founders together of the Rising Tide Foundation, and Matt's had the Canadian Patriot.org going since I think 2012. Yep. And he's amassed a wonderful bit of work that Brandi's going to show with you.
Yep.
We got the Unfinished Symphony,
Two Americas,
and then volume 2.
Yep. Sweet. And volume 3, and I have the copy of the volume 4
because I spaced it. We're supposed to bring volume 2.
That's cool, guys.
But it is back home, and we just want to share with Matt. He also did 4 volumes on the untold history of Canada as well, and he's from Quebec, Montreal, I do believe, right?
Yeah, that is my birthplace of origin.
Yeah,
in this life, yeah.
And we just want to do that just for some of the people who might be meeting Matt for the first time on this network. And we are going to do a deep dive in a system that I don't think a lot of people realize that when they think of political economy, a lot of times you think of a lot of the isms that have been formulated over the last 200-300 years, things like capitalism and socialism and communism and fascism. All these different isms seem to have confused people about what a really solid system of both economics and politics and how they can work together.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that we'd like to delve into with you because it's so well laid out in your books and in your studies, and definitely in a lot of your lectures as well over the years.
Yeah, thanks, guys. And I always love our chats. They're always so fun and organic and substantial. So I always look forward to these things. And I think the idea of making today's theme the American system of political economy. What is it? Why don't we know about it today in general? It's been written out of so many of our economics and even history textbooks, or obscured, oversimplified to the point of non-existence, that we don't even recognize how it is that we, as freedom-loving human beings, have been able to successfully do battle with the system of empire, of rapacious master-slave, ideological driven oligarchs who have tried for centuries and centuries, and probably millennia, to keep us in a situation of physical and mental and spiritual darkness, enslaved by an upper uber, one might call in modern terms overhumans, ubermenschen, that would be the better people controlling as masters the inferior people as lower useless eaters. We've fought against that. We've been able to accomplish wonderful revolutions in science, in economics, in freedom, in statecraft, in the arts. And the fact that we don't learn about this, the most recent incarnation of one of the most powerful tools that we have as weapons of defense and offense against the system of evil, has been the American system of economics. And the fact that we have not been taught this, and it's been so successfully scrubbed out of our history books, makes us incapable of understanding how this fight has been waged over hundreds of years, thousands of years. And thus people are who hate things like the Great Reset. There's I think a big spike in awareness en masse across Europe, North America, that there is a conspiracy, a long-standing conspiracy to bring us to a very bad destination. But a lot of the people who don't like this conspiracy, they want to protect their family, their nation, their traditions. They don't have the tools necessary to carry out that battle effectively because of the lack of knowledge. So it's good that we're going to focus on a little bit of that story of what it is, how it works, what differentiates it from the more popular systems of political economy that you referenced that are taught in today's business management poli-sci courses, which is devoid of this special something that we're hopefully going to make transparent today.
Yeah, that brings up, makes me think about Gandhi's quote, secrecy is the enemy of freedom, because this hidden history that has been purposely left out, really our love of comprehension and our understanding and our desire to learn about our true history really is our only way to combat that which has been kept from us, right? We always have these negative reference points in our history where we got it wrong and the bad actors and all that, but it's also very important to have the good reference points, like the reference points of the American system and who was fighting for those and who's the true enemy. And things get so confusing now. China's the enemy. And you said something in your the IC video that you did with Dr. Reiner Fulmich.
Yeah.
And so I just want to bring it up because I think it's a good thing just to mention, because I know you'll repeat it. This is your quote, Mr. Matt Ehret. You were describing why you named your book series, The Clash of the Two Americas. You said, because I'm really just trying to find ways to get people to appreciate that there's not just one America, just like there's not just one Britain. There's not one Russia. There's not one China. There's not one any country. That's a simplistic story. Basically, it's a children's story that has been masquerading as historical fact. It's not true. And I think that what we're doing with this discussion is really bringing out those ones that are not.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I thanks for bringing that up. It's an important point that I can't emphasize enough. And you guys get it. A lot of people still have to learn that lesson, that, this idea that you could talk about the USA versus Russia in the Cold War, or Iran versus another country. It's like that doesn't make any sense. The reality is that we have an oligarchical system today, just as we did a century ago, 2 centuries ago, 1,000 years, 2,000 years ago. There's always been this oligarchical higher caste system that self-identifies as something more than their victims, the majority of human beings. That maintains a continuity of bloodlines, that tries to keep their gene pool kind of shallow, based on certain ideological perverse assumptions that their power and right and virtue to rule over the many is contained somehow in their either, today we use the terminology genetics. Before that, there was the blood. But regardless, it's wrong. And actually, now that we have, scientific investigations of the more recent, generations have demonstrated that actually is what weakens you, both mentally and physically. It weakens you to keep things in a shallow gene pool. But they do that, and a lot of these are the old noble families. Some of them can trace their lineage back to the Roman Senate, the Roman Imperium of yesteryear. And this has been like a parasite trying to latch on over nation states and influencing and subverting any institution that they can from within. And when we read our history books, we're told, oh, if you try to treat this oligarchy as having some causal role to play in anything regarding the cause of wars, assassinations, anything, you're a conspiracy theorist, and you should not be respected or published or hired in any polite society or academia. So this type of psychological shaming has really caused a lot of people who know better to shut up and to go along with popular narratives that assume that oligarchical systems don't exist in any continuous fashion, or that conspiracies, if we allow them to exist, are simply localized in space and time to something very, very limited. Maybe, the conspiracy by Enron to make money and loot people in California or something. That's an okay conspiracy because you can reduce it to desire to make money. And so that's all. It doesn't require multi-generational conspiracies. That's okay. But anytime you start getting at something that implies a higher quality of secrecy that maintains itself over generations, no, there your mind has to turn off. So hence the two Americas there, and as you and I, as you guys and I have discussed, and Cynthia has discussed too, with you, the United States has never extracted this foreign agency from its midst that it declared war or independence from the British Empire back in 1776. but the British has been able to maintain fifth colonists over the course of the past 250 years inside of the heart of the United States, which is behind, if anybody wants to understand what the deep state is today, what is the shadow government, who was it that organized the creation of the Federal Reserve, the assassination and cover up of so many great presidents, you wouldn't be able to answer it if you don't look at this British run fifth column that utilizes certain Freemasonic outfits like the Scottish Rite Freemasonry. That was a British intelligence operation from the get-go in the late or 1801 period when it was originally set up, or the Wall Street banking structures that was set up as another extension of the city of London, the square mile city, the city within a city, right, that has more power than any nation. That's Wall Street. That's the branch in America that interfaces with these various intelligence outfits that created the FBI, that created the CIA, that purged America of its better statesmen and people who were very, very wise and solid on intelligence matters throughout the last 250 years. We had wonderful people who have been also written out of history or obscured to the point of stupidity, like Edgar Allan Poe or Samuel Finley Breese Morse, or people who are just treated today like they're just inventors or literary figures, but we don't realize that no, these were actually some of the greatest heroes and patriots of America who did much more with their creative powers than we realize, because their enemies took control of the narrative and obscured everything dangerous about them and kept only stories of Hollywood, or not Hollywood, Halloween horror from Edgar Poe, or we're allowed to know about the Morse code, but we don't know about Morse's pamphlets exposing the Jesuit Freemasonic operations embedded throughout the United States in the 1830s, which is what he was, he would have said that was probably much more important than even many of his inventions. So
that's fascinating too, when you think about how the political economy was built upon writings from early on as Franklin.
Yeah.
And then it's interesting how they all build on each other, right?
Yeah.
So as Franklin started to write some of the earliest things about, I think he was pulling from Colbert and from France, I do believe. I mean, wasn't Franklin probably pulling from those elements and then that's what Hamilton eventually picked up on, because he's much younger than Franklin. Maybe you could discuss some of those real foundings of the American system would be cool. I think it'd be good for people.
Yeah, I think we could do that. That's a great idea. Well, yeah, this is the idea that there's been a fight for a science of political economy, a science of economy, and this is something which it's important to tackle it in this way, and this is how Benjamin Franklin understood the idea of economics that he put forth in things like the 1727 essay on the necessity for a paper currency, or his 1751 observations concerning the increase of mankind, or the hundreds and hundreds of other very important pamphlets that he drafted and put into action, throughout the course of his very productive life. And he understood that economics, properly understood, is not just the science of worshiping money or buying low, selling dear, which is what was popularized by certain Hellfire Club disciples then, which was just like sort of today's people are probably aware of certain satanic, eyes wide shut sort of operations, Epstein Island operations, very perverse things, Jimmy Savile's. These are probably things that I would imagine the people watching this program are familiar with elements of this. There's a certain perversity within the oligarchy itself. That's not new. So you had things back in the early 1700s when Ben Franklin was just a child being recruited to certain patriotic networks in the colonies around Cotton Mather and John Winthrop Jr., who had been organizing to create, as was originally outlined in the founding documents of the Charter of Massachusetts, a city on a hill that would be the role model upon which a new type of civilization for all of mankind would eventually be built, premised around the idea that humankind is a species made in the image of God, that it can be proven by the fact that we can increase our productive powers of labor by discovering the laws of creation and willfully translating and modifying our behavior in accordance with those new discovered laws. And that technological progress was the material expression to that metaphysical, spiritual concept, right? Because it's one thing to just talk about these beautiful, nice concepts, but to prove it scientifically requires the expression of new types of inventions that allow us to sustain more of our species at a higher quality of life with better access to our creative powers by leaping over the limits to growth that no other species can do. So that's what Benjamin Franklin was recruited to. And the enemies of that paradigm were organizing at the time of Benjamin Franklin's youth in Britain. Britain had just recently started becoming an empire. We forget sometimes that America itself was a British, the people in the colonies identified themselves as British colonists. They were British citizens, but they represented, as I pointed out in the remark that you cited from the Rainer Friedrich presentation, there's two Britons too. There's two Englands. And you have the Shakespearean England, the England of Thomas More, of Erasmus, that saw everything I just said as being true. And then you had the other Hellfire Club England, the England of John Dee, of the Rosicrucian, occultists who are taking over British intelligence and inducing a stupid King Henry VIII to fall into divide and conquer strategies, declaring himself, the head of the church, a new church that he created from scratch, which just played right into a forever war policy of divide to conquer, getting Christians to kill Christians, which is the way the empire always works, right? Get people who are different to fight over their differences, and they'll be so busy fighting that they won't be able to notice who's extracting wealth from all sides and dominating all sides of the belligerents. So that's what was taking over control in the 16th century of Britain. And by the end of the 17th century, there was one last fight by the humanists, the Platonic Augustinian humanists that I was just mentioning, who took advantage of a sort of period of instability in Britain that had emerged in the wake of a takeover that was known in today's history books as the Glorious Revolution of 1688. This is about 15 years before Ben Franklin was born. And this is a period, what is the Glorious Revolution? That was the Dutch Venetian takeover of England, with the Dutch king who didn't even speak English installed as a puppet king in Britain in 1688. And with that came an occult, the factions of the occult black magic circles that were circulating around people like Sir Isaac Newton took advantage of this takeover and asserted their dominance. They reestablished the power and might of the City of London as a center of global financial controls, which it is to this very day. They also created the Bank of England in 1694.
There it is.
Right. This is set up as an operation modeled on the Bank of Amsterdam that had been created about 80 years earlier. So the Bank of England was the world's second private central bank, which would be sort of an entity outside of the government, but that would then control the behavior of, or use the government as a tool of establishing a new global Western Roman Empire that would establish. The idea was to establish it as a one world global authority, subverting all other civilizations and nation states from existence. Who was the main master of the mint of the Bank of England? Sir Isaac Newton himself was a master of the mint. And it's known today that, even though he's celebrated as the great scientist of all humankind in all time, the great, almost like godhead of science, who had apples fall on his head and thus came up with amazing universal mathematical formulas of gravity. The fact is, he was a black magician, and all of the known writings that have been preserved by Newton, not a single work of authentic experimental science exists. It's all, and there was even a case where John Maynard Keynes, a disciple of Newton, bought at auction about 90 years ago, a chest found in Cambridge's basement of Newton's papers, and he made a whole press conference thinking, okay, now we're going to unveil to the world how we're going to finally know how Newton made his discoveries of gravitation and the calculus. It's in here, and he opens it up, and what happens is it's just hundreds of thousands of pages of numerology and black magic, and no science. So the evidence is pointing, and again, one wouldn't be able to make sense of this, and I only was fortunate enough to encounter this way of looking at this whole period in world history that was sort of a pivot around which world history really moved, through the works of Lyndon LaRouche, who was a recently deceased, incredible American economist and statesman, who pulled a lot of this research together with a team of very, very powerful thinkers that he was working with for 50 years or more even. So a lot of their research is pioneering, and I was able to, over the course of some years, replicate some of their research and bring it to life in my mind. So this is really meaningful to me, and I'm thankful that I had that experience. But all that to say, the battle around Ben Franklin, I think it couldn't really be understood because Ben Franklin was a scientist, right? He was known as not any old little tinkerer like he's often taught today, but he was like known in his lifetime as the greatest scientist of the world, who discovered something that no other. He had like a grade 2 education from the backwoods of the outskirts of the empire, and he was able to trump through a method of thinking and a method of identity, a quality of identity. He was able to trump every single grandiose, famous scientist of all Europe over the question of what is the nature of electricity? How do you understand it? How does the mind of mankind resonate to this new property of the universe that we've never understood? But by this understanding, we now have a power to wield it in such a manner that we can create lightning rods. We can create things that allow us to transmit messaging, information, utilizing electricity effectively. And Ben Franklin was part of a network looking at this thing that were anti-Newtonian. So he was one of the greatest anti-Newtonian scientists, and his discovery came about in around 1751, 52. And that was always tied directly to his discoveries in natural law and political science that manifested in 1776 in a full way. But it was never two different things in his mind. So to understand that, you have to understand, well, what was the Newtonian movement of occultists, then part of the oligarchic takeover of England in the 1690s. Newton died in 1727. Overlapping, Benjamin Franklin was a young man.
Right.
Ben Franklin wasn't alone either. But you have to look at, well, what was this takeover? What were the goods? And some of the best scientists, of England at the time were influencing Ben Franklin and the network of Platonic Augustinian humanists that were active around Franklin in the Americas. So when you look at, well, what was going on when King William of Orange dies, he's a flamboyant homosexual. He has no children. He can't have heirs. So Queen Anne ends up becoming the queen. So Anne becomes the queen. She's I believe she's from the House of Stuart. Now she's having a problem. She's a good person, but she's being poisoned, and her children are being poisoned. There's something like 18 of her children who all don't live past infancy. It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. Yeah, it's crazy. She doesn't know it half the time. She has some trusted advisors like Sarah Churchill, the wife of Lord John Churchill, the Lord of Marlborough, who's the head at the time of the Venetian takeover of Britain. He's somebody who puts himself in charge. He's a slime ball, but he finds himself in a position of such power that he takes charge of the British armies. He's the head of the armies. He's always pushing for war with France. France having been one of the organic allies of England. The better French and the better English have always been allied since the days of Louis XI and Henry VII, who were the first two Platonic humanist real philosopher kings over a century earlier. And these were like Renaissance movements that were always inclined to work together, just like we have with the United States and Russia, right? Back in the 19th century, it was because of that tendency to find communion and collaboration that you had the success of the American Revolution, was because of Russia's support under Catherine the Great, or later on Tsar Alexander II's support for Lincoln during the Civil War was the reason why Lincoln was able to keep the Union together through the help of Russia, and vice versa. It was reciprocated. Yeah. So you got these. This was always the fear of the empire, that these movements would converge. In France, same deal, and that was because you had the Colbertist at the time. Colbert was the finance minister of France, and his mentor, who we've all discussed in a previous episode, Jules Mazarin, was the grand architect of the modern sovereign nation state system, which itself was established and based upon, was successful because of the idea of creating a new type of government premised around the benefit of the other, but also the idea that economics should be about moving treasuries away from investments into war making and into things like canal building, building schools, education with your neighbors, other nations that would work together to find a harmony of interests.
Okay.
And Colbert, in his writings, understood that the cause of value was not the money that people wanted. It was rather the power of the mind of people and the inspiration of the people to self-perfect. And that was the purpose of government and the leaders of the people as representatives, was to help facilitate that natural process. So there were obviously very like-minded people, and under Queen Anne, many of them came to power. Those Colbertists of England, who always were trying to create entente alliances, collaboration with France and other nations of Europe to avoid the trappings of war that people like John Churchill were trying to initiate, or Sarah Churchill, the confidant of Queen Anne, were trying to organize. They were always so they were followers of the Colbertist mode of thinking, and there were people like Sir Robert Harley, who became Prime Minister of England under Queen Anne. His advisors included such incredible people as Daniel Defoe, the author of Robinson Crusoe, was actually a close advisor, and was an author. He was commissioned by Harley to author a bill that went into law in 1696, 2 years after the Bank of England was created, to create a national land bank to replace the Bank of England early on, so that it would not take over control of British destiny. And the National Land Bank, which people can read Daniel Defoe's drafting of this beautiful document, it was designed entirely to emit credit, productive credit, for improvement of the land, of the people, and educational institutions, all of these things you would want to have. Also, it was very much involving a protective tariff to favor the development of industrial progress internally. So that there was people like that. There were people like Jonathan Swift, who's famous for his anti-depopulation tracts, A Modest Proposal, or A Tale of the Tub, which decimated the Enlightenment Aristotelian scholars around Descartes and Locke. That's what Jonathan Swift was writing, as well as obviously Gulliver's Travels.
Mhm.
He was an advisor of Robert Harley. So a lot of these greatest literary poets and artists were also scientists and working politically with the highest quality statesmen, who were advising and influencing the Queen Anne administration in a very positive way. And one of the key figures that makes all of this very, very important, more important than I think people realize, is one of the arch enemies of Isaac Newton, in the figure of the greatest scientist of his day, and I think possibly of all times, named Gottfried Leibniz.
Leibniz.
Okay.
And Leibniz is the founder of, as LaRouche states, I've got a book here from 1985 called So You Wish to Learn All About Economics by Lyndon LaRouche.
I think, yeah.
A little bit rattered and torn here, but LaRouche attributes Leibniz to being sort of the godfather, the founding father of the science of physical economy. And people could type in Google even Leibniz's Society and Economy from 1674, which outlines what an actual coherent science based on the increase of the productive powers of labor looks like, how the moral values that would be tied to such a science. And he goes through the need to break down the control of the private financier class that would otherwise want to control the monopolies and contract the means of supporting our population. He goes through it in a very, very, very concise, efficient manner. But Leibniz isn't just that. He's known as, just like Ben Franklin a little bit later, but Leibniz is the top scientist of the world. He's the discoverer of the infinitesimal calculus, and he's again one of the arch enemies of both Isaac Newton as well as the Cartesian school that had perverted science in France and was spreading beyond the borders of France. The followers of René Descartes, and also Hobbes, Thomas Hobbes, the influential court philosopher of the British Empire who posited that all human beings are just beasts fighting with other beasts, and that the only way to control or bring order to humankind would be by the creation of some form of supranational leviathan that could impose order onto the bestial, selfish human beings who can only fight with each other. That was Hobbes. So Leibniz, he's decimating all of these different ideologues who are all creating intellectual frameworks that really just hide a justification for the imperial mode of existence in various ways. And one of the key things he gets at is that he in his refutations of the Newtonian worldview in his Leibniz versus Clarke correspondence, Samuel Clarke being one of the handlers at the Royal Society, the British Royal Society of Isaac Newton, he gets across that no, the Newtonian cosmology, the idea of space, time, and matter in the Newtonian worldview, Leibniz is explaining, and it's true, presumes an irrational God, a tyrannical God that is made in our image, that we've projected our own biases onto our concept of God, the creator, and the creation, which acts like a clock winding down. And it's true in the Newtonian system, there's certain assumptions that are not proven but are forced upon us that Leibniz does battle with. And keep in mind, Leibniz discovered the calculus. It wasn't Newton. Even though we're told that Newton discovered the calculus and maybe Leibniz did too. No, that's garbage. Leibniz discovered the calculus. He published how he discovered it decades before Newton did. Newton never shows you how he did it, and his actual so-called discoveries happened years and years and years after Leibniz. So Leibniz discovered it. It was plagiarized by Newton, as was everything Newton is attributed to. You can always find, and I dare people to who might be listening out there to prove me wrong, every single discovery attributed to Isaac Newton will have been discovered by real scientists way before Newton, from people like Christian Huygens, Pierre de Fermat, Kepler, Johannes Kepler, who actually is the discoverer of gravity, and especially Gottfried Leibniz. So I'm just throwing that out there as a segue. But now Leibniz makes the point, Newton presumes that there is empty space, just like Descartes does, that there's these self-evident objects called mass, just that have volume occupying space, that due to the difference in distance and density of each one emit occult-like forces of attraction and repulsion without any deeper sense of causality. That's simply adequate. He's imposing a mathematical description onto the physical universe and annihilating the reasons why such attraction or repulsion would even exist in the first place, by assuming all of these entities like empty space within a three-dimensional XYZ Cartesian grid. Leibniz, being a follower of Plato, of Kepler, he makes the point, no, the only reason why mass would have this type of relationship, like planets moving around a sun or anything for that matter, would be because there's a harmony, that there's a harmony built in and organizing the fabric of space-time itself. And that the creator of said harmony would have created things in the way he did in no other way, because he deemed that this particular configuration and the laws and the principles organizing said configuration were the best of all possible worlds. Now, the people attacking Leibniz for this would be like, well, that's stupid. You're a naive fool, because I can imagine a world that is better. And thus, because there's evil in the world, God could not have done things the way you say he did. But then Leibniz responds saying, no, the reason why I'm right is because I can make it better, because we have free will to intervene, to make it better, to judge that it could be better. And I have a conscience that can pull on me and guide my mind and my thoughts and my identity to intervene. Means that it is the best of all possible worlds. Because if it was perfect, the way people like Voltaire, a follower and popularizer of Isaac Newton after Newton dies, the way Voltaire, makes fun of Leibniz in his Candide. Leibniz, basically Voltaire says, well, the only way this you could be right would be if we were all perfect and things couldn't be any better. And Leibniz is like, well, no, if things were as perfect as they could possibly, such that there was no freedom to make things better, it would be a worse universe because we wouldn't have freedom. Freedom would be thus irrelevant. We would all be automata. We'd all be boards, like machinery, right?
Trying to turn us into.
Yeah.
It's just so good, man. It's such a well, I mean, I think for a lot of people, I hope this is a breath of fresh air that he's showing that the clash of two systems and sharing some of the history of these clashes, even before we get into America. So like that bank that they tried to create as an alternative to the city of London, that's the bank that Hamilton actually adopted our first bank after, not the city of London.
Right.
Like a lot of people think. Right.
Yeah.
That was an interesting little point. Cause I remember reading that in your books. I was like, yeah, that bank that they tried to create. So how'd they squash that? Because obviously it didn't persist. Like,
okay, yeah. Well, how they squashed it, like they do for so many things, if they can't crush it in the cradle, what they'll do is they'll try to destroy it from within, right? Corrupt it from within. And that's what they did for the National Land Bank of England.
got it.
So when Queen Anne dies in 1714, and this has already been ongoing before that, the bank had been infiltrated by the agents of the Hellfire Club, people like, who were followers of the theories of Bernard Mandeville. Right. Bernard Mandeville being one of the ideological sort of father figures, influencers of the Hellfire Club, child sacrifice, all sorts of like nasty shit going on there. Bernard Mandeville is a figure who wrote a book called The Fable of the Bees, or as subtitled on Private Vices, Public Virtues, in around 1708, I want to say. And basically he puts forth in a more visceral, unambiguous manner than that same thesis was tweaked later on in a more sophisticated way by another British imperial thinker named Adam Smith. But he's a bit more visceral about it. So it's interesting to read his writings. But his thesis is that if you want public virtue, if you want progress, what you have to do is allow everybody to act in accordance with their vices. He gives the example of, for example, the highwayman, the robber who kills a guy, and steals his purse. And he's like, well, you might think that that's a bad thing, reader, but actually, let's look at what this highwayman does with the money he's just stolen. He goes into town, he buys a prostitute. You might think that that's a bad thing, reader, but what does that prostitute do with the money that she got? Well, she goes and buys some buttons for her blouse. What does that do? Well, that is a stimulus for enterprising button makers who now can have money to improve the machinery of their button making skills. They will now buy food for their family, right? Which now stimulates the bread maker, and then he has this whole construct of like how this is like how personal sin and vices give rise to virtue and goodness. Kind of like not that different from let everybody just pursue their own desire for maximizing pleasure and avoiding pain and buy low, sell dear, and the invisible hand of the marketplace is just going to magically create goodness and creative innovation naturally if we just let everybody just be selfish the way that they're designed to be in an unbounded way.
We call it partying like you're a rock star.
Partying like a rock star.
Yeah. There's people out there that literally just party like they're rock stars and, fuck, eat, and travel. And then it's just nonstop sex, drugs, rock and roll. I mean, I think there was some decent music, but there definitely was much more of the sex and the drugs that perverted it,
The destruction by debauchery.
I mean, even talking to some of the folks, like we got a good friend who was at Woodstock when she was 17, and giving her the information about how they had infiltrated that movement and brought those people like her, kind of isolated them away from, because she was a real activist and still is in her own, in her thinking, so it's really interesting how they turned a lot of them into yuppies, and then many of them just ended up perishing or dying, like dying with a utopian dream that never manifested, right?
Yeah.
So
exactly.
It's like an early color revolution, and now the seeds of that or even someone like myself who did not have hippie parents at all. I had first generation Italian parents. So my upbringing was much more anchored in really a lot of love and family and a decent education. So I learned the basics well enough that I could think for myself. And it's even interesting when you think of simple roots like a lot of us had in terms of our status, like very simple, humble roots, and that we're exploring the mind and sharing parts of history that we shouldn't have access to if they were successful in their whole old New World Order. If they've been successful in their brave New World Order,
we wouldn't have this conversation right now. Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, I just want to give everybody just a moment to reflect on something that's so simple and we take for granted.
Dude,
Like,
that's so important. Yeah, people have to just like sort of take stock and appreciate the fact that we have what we have because they're not as powerful as they want to project that they are. That's very important to have that space. And yeah, like to get back to the question on how was this land bank subverted? Well, the thing was the followers of Bernard Mandeville and this Hellfire Club network that had infiltrated the land bank early on ended up basically applying the fruits of their theories of economics into its administration, kind of like as how anything is corrupted. And it becomes a speculative bank. It becomes it's transformed into what's called the South Sea Company. So the South Sea Company becomes a speculative instrument around gambling on the future values of presumed land that doesn't even exist in the colonies in the Americas and South America and blah, blah, blah. And basically people pour their investments into it. It kind of serves like a Dutch tulip bubble of England that becomes the biggest bubble then known to history. And it erupts and explodes finally in 1720 and goes bankrupt. And the thing is destroyed from within that way. However, the fact that Alexander Hamilton drafted his report on a national bank and the constitutionality of a national bank and the report on credit and his report on manufacturers in 1791-92 on the British system, he made references to the British system. Now, in some ways, yeah, I do think, and having read the draft of the English land bank, I think that was probably something he had looked at. But also, from the standpoint of purely mechanics,
right.
The Bank of England as a mechanism, it has things that you would want to use. If you cared about your nation state, you would want to use the structure of a Bank of England. Now, you would want to not have the Trojan horses, the private ownership, the ideological framework that posits that the bank should only do things that involve investments that are tied to war or speculation. That's going to that's economic terrorism and warfare. So you wouldn't want that. But the mechanism itself, yeah, there's certain similarities that Hamilton does make an argument. Yeah, look, these things can work with the Bank of England, so let's do that here. Now, his enemies, who are ironically the very same operatives who later on created the Federal Reserve, these are the enemies of the Hamiltonian movement, the people who were actually supporting people like Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln's greenback system and his entire system of political economy was rooted directly in Alexander Hamilton's revolution in political economy that itself had been informed by Benjamin Franklin's studies of the behavior of political economy. Now, they will say, oh no, Hamilton was a Rothschild British stooge because he makes reference to the Bank of England. They ignore everything about the Hamiltonian American bank that is tied to function, purpose, design, what it did. They ignore all of that. They ignore the fact that it was through this instrument that that America was able to stay alive in the precarious first, few decades of its existence, and not only stay alive and pay off all of the war debts that it had incurred, because it was bankrupt before 1790, totally bankrupt, but it was able to create a new federal system that allowed the nation as a whole to quadruple its population in only 40 years. And within that space of a short 40-year period, the productive powers of labor were increased massively by the banks being used with the different branches in different parts of the colony, or now early nation, to provide loans to entrepreneurs, to farmers, to people who had productive knowledge and just needed a tractor, and or For example, building bigger projects like the Erie Canal, one of the biggest projects of the world at that time, was done through the purely the driving force of the National Bank. So, which worked in conjunction with the idea of a framework of protective tariffs to block the dumping of cheap goods. It all worked together, and also allow free trade, which was good if you had free trade amongst the states, which formerly didn't have free trade amongst each other. So free trade is not intrinsically bad. It works actually really nicely if you have a moral principle of honest cooperation governing the behavior of the different members who are enjoying free trade contracts. It's that you otherwise you can't really have a viable nation state if all of the provinces or states are fighting with each other for their own right to carve out a bit of interest within a pool of diminishing returns. So that's the problem of Canada, for example. Canada is a nation which looks really big under the British Empire. Like, I mean, we're a British system, but we've never been allowed by the British controllers of Canada ever to have free trade amongst the provinces.
Dang.
Which is why Canada is only, we don't have free trade.
I mean, how's that? Were there these
Ontario is
promoters
fighting
of free
Quebec.
trade
Ontario
over
is fighting
the
Saskatchewan. BC is fighting Alberta. That's why we don't have any really. There's so few big projects that overlap the provinces, and how our population is 1/10 of what America's is, even though we've been around for a really long time. Why is our population so low? And it's so underdeveloped, right? All the 7 cities that have been allowed to be born in Canada are all within like 70 miles of the US border. We've got this, everything else is just not developed by design, right? So that's part of the deal. And you can imagine something similar would have been the fate of America had similar had a similarly divided nation been kept under the control of the British elite of Wall Street that had set themselves up. So, and it was only when Hamilton's bank was finally annihilated by an operation that had been created by the founding father of America's deep state in so many ways, and Wall Street, was Aaron Burr. And his machinery was put into operation. He not only killed Hamilton directly, and Hamilton's son earlier on, Philip Hamilton, who was killed at the same spot that his dad, Alexander, was killed 2 years later with the same guns by a stooge of Aaron Burr. That was part of what drove, I think, Alexander Hamilton a little bit crazy to make some bad decisions. But then Hamilton's creation of the bank was finally annihilated by a stooge of Burr, another stooge named Andrew Jackson, through whose mansion was the base of operations for the Burr Plan in 1807 to create a Western secessionist front movement that Burr was supposed to be the emperor of, after he then would kill Jefferson and take control of the United States, allowing the slave colonies to go free with their own pro-British treaty and have a integrated northern, a West Territory, northern free state integration with the British territories of the Canadas. That was the Burr Plan. The house that the whole thing was being organized through as headquarters was Andrew Jackson's mansion. Jackson was his tool, who he put to work with the whole Jackson kitchen cabinet, who finally did the job of slaughtering Hamilton's bank and undoing. Hamilton was one of the greatest champions for the integration of the Cherokee with the United States through technological progress. Him and Benjamin Franklin were both massive leaders of working with the First Nations people at finding the best of all cultures that could then create the fabric of a peaceful, trustworthy, not coexistence, but mutual cooperation together. And that was undone by Jackson's Trail of Tears and his genocide against the Cherokee and his empowering of the slave states of the South to basically, take the Cherokee territory and turn it into cotton plantation, for human black labor to extract wealth based on the Bernard Mandeville logic of private vice, public virtue. So that's the same bloody thing, and it's all justified by a certain cosmology of what you see in the Newtonian system. So if you look at Adam Smith, look at John Locke, a lot of the people who were taught today are like the inspiration for the American Revolution, these British imperialist racist shitheads. That's who Americans are told inspired the American Revolution. No, these were people who were misanthropic. They were all devoted believers in depopulation and a master slave dichotomy, and they were all promoting systems of scientific management based upon the idea that human beings are just these particles floating, pulling and pushing through laws of attraction that are expressed as desires, hedonistic desires that impel us to attract that which gives us sensual pleasure and propel, attract away, repel that which gives us pain. This is the idea of, it's very similar to the Newtonian system of particles floating, pushing and pulling based on, action at a distance and the inverse square law, right? But they do that for human systems as well. And they say thus to the credulous fools who believe in their system that if you want progress, you have to just let everybody just do their own thing and progress is magically just going to happen. And when that goes wrong, when that necessarily turns into speculative messes and basket case, bubbles that collapse in on themselves, which it always happens that way. Every time you give people you say, oh, you like freedom? Let's make you drunk on freedom. We'll give you so much freedom, you're going to be sick of freedom. And that happens. That's happened with the South Sea bubble. It happened with the tulip bubble. It happens every single time. And when that happens, then you say, oh, see, we weren't capable of governing ourselves in the human zoo. We needed a zookeeper. We needed a Leviathan, says Hobbes. We needed a one world government. We needed a great reset to bring order to the chaos that we naturally are. That's the way it always works. And it's disgusting. Yeah.
I want to show everybody.
You got to share the screen.
Yeah, I'm going to share the screen in a minute here. I mean, here's a good shot of good old Mr. Aaron Burr with his, this is something. All this is in Matt's first volume, just so you guys know. So, right, what he's just been talking about is so well laid out with some pictures, with more detail. I mean, it's brilliant. You want to share this right here.
Oh, you're about to end it. You have that on the red button.
And there's a classic picture from the book of Mr. Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton. What was really interesting, too, was how, as he mentioned, the slavery aspect. So a lot of the founding fathers, like George Washington, freed all his slaves upon his death. And a lot of the people who were founding fathers and who were slave owners did just that. There were a handful, obviously, like Jefferson, that didn't do that. And we do know that the Southern contingency was where a lot of this deep state plays out. But what I wanted to go to was something down on page 114 where you talk about, and I think you're going to enjoy this segue, understanding the trifold nature of the deep state. Remember that?
Yeah.
I know you do, but I just like it because right in here, you talk about it, the three prongs of the operation that Burr led on behalf of British intelligence and which remains active to this very day. And there was the Anglo-Canadian establishment. There was the Eastern establishment that basically, they're the ones that infiltrated the Federalist Party of Hamilton, right? And what was interesting about them is they were very involved in the opium trade against China at the time.
Yes.
Right. And then you got the Virginia junto, which we were just kind of starting to talk about a little bit because that's in Jefferson's state. But then you also got the Mazzini connections, Young Americans, and Albert Pike and the KK, who's the KKK founder. So I just thought that was an interesting little part in your book that I don't think a lot of people are aware of. And that's why I wanted to bring it up.
Yeah, no, they don't. I mean, they tend to think of, that's why we all went through this process when trying to wrap the mind around conspiracies, right? Like it's an arduous process. But sometimes people stop their search too short, thinking that they get too satisfied too soon, prematurely. And a place where a lot of people get satisfied is thinking, okay, there is an American empire. America is out to be at the heart of a one world government. They've done so much evil, and that's a mistake. I as a Canadian, it was easy for me to think that at first, trying to learn how to trying to think about conspiracies for the first time. For a couple of years, I held on to that one, and then I was like, well, wait a minute, it kept bothering me. But America keeps screwing itself over. Like they're in such a worse place today than they were 50, 60 years ago.
Because they
Why
don't
would they do that?
well, because the
How-
Americans don't realize how badly we were used and abused by globalization.
Yeah,
Everybody, you know what I mean? Everybody don't realize.
And the
Yeah,
enemy
say it.
didn't go away. Like
Right.
it just got deeper in, is I think.
Yeah.
More
Like, you lose
entrenched.
sight of who the enemy is and where they
A lot of
are.
Americans have lost complete sight, Matt, of who
exactly. And it's like the Americans have gotten the population didn't benefit. The nation as a whole is not more secure because of what it did to the world over the past, 60 years since Vietnam, especially didn't benefit. So America is more insecure. It has more people who hate and want to destroy America because, that's what happens when you regime change countries too much and you abuse them. They kind of feel natural resentment towards you. That's not necessarily going to make you more secure. You're an economic basket case. The economy has become a giant hollowed out shell industrially. It can't produce for itself. It's a giant bubble. That's not good. Even for the so-called like elites within America, that's not even good. So it's like, well, who really benefited by this whole, like, it wasn't the people, it wasn't even American business class didn't really seem to benefit. It was like, who benefited? And then you're like, okay, then I started entertaining the idea that, okay, there's this other thing that's above the nations, that's done what we've been talking about. And then, some people will catch that, but then they'll still think of it as being sort of one-dimensional in America. It's the deep state. It's the Freemasons, it's the Jews, it's the whatever. There's so many variants on the theme, right? It's the UFO thing. So whatever. There's so many variants on it. But then when you actually look at, well, okay, America doesn't exist in a vacuum. Neither does Canada. And I mean, I'm a Canadian, so I started to try to. My original inquiry was, well, what is Canada? Why are we still a monarchy? Why did we fail the Ben Franklin challenge to join as a 14th colony, saying to the British, we're going to be independent and create this new type of society? We failed.
Yeah,
So
most people don't even know.
no, most people don't know. Most Canadians don't know. This is obviously the case. Yeah, even though Benjamin Franklin again created Canada's postal service in 1854. That was Ben Franklin who created Canada's postal service. He created our first newspapers. It was Ben Franklin created Canada's first newspapers. The things you need to have, like a sovereign citizenry capable of self-directedness and is being informed, knowing what's going on, right? Being able to communicate with other parts of your nation. Without that, you can't have a citizenry that's capable of self-government anyway. So Benjamin Franklin was thinking way ahead of the curve. And most Canadians don't know of any of that. They don't know of Ben Franklin up here trying to organize a Canadian delegation to come down in 1776. They don't know about that. But that was my thing. I was like, okay, I was trying to make sense of that. I just become involved at the time in 2007 with a Canadian branch of the LaRouche organization. And so I began volunteering. And so a lot of these paradoxes were hitting me fast. And if people have read some of LaRouche's writings over the years, he's been around since the 60s as a political fighter. They will notice that he has made, especially since the late 70s, a lot of reference to the British Empire still existing. The British Empire. He always hammered. And at first I was like, that's crazy talk, man. The British Empire is long gone. But then, you get enough information and I'm like, okay, well, we're part of the British. Canada's part of the British Empire. Like we're the head of state is the Governor General, who's the unelected arm of the monarch in Canada. So it's like we're still part of this thing. This thing's still maybe it's rebranded under the Commonwealth, but this is still the center of global drug money laundering through British Cayman Islands. Most of the mining companies that control Africa are in the London Stock Exchange and within British Commonwealth countries, South Africa and Canada and London itself, obviously, Australia. So it's like, well, it does seem to have a huge amount of power. British intelligence is behind the Five Eyes. The more you look, you're like British is just everywhere. So I was like, well, what's Canada? So from there, I had to sort of piece together or recast Canada's history with new knowledge, new investigations that took me into a place that had to recognize some difficult, somewhat bitter truths about the fact that most of the people who were Canadians are told were our heroes or our founding fathers were ugly, misanthropic traitors and failures of human beings. And some of the people who were taught to despise or not even think about as far as Canadians in our history were actually wonderful human beings who in many cases sacrificed their lives for the concept of creating an independent Canada and the greater good. People who've been scrubbed from our history books. So that manifested in a series of 4 books called The Untold History of Canada, right? But then I had a bit of a mapping of how some of these oligarchical networks were groomed, were brought to power, how they suppressed things like the Canadian rebellions. We did have one Republican rebellion in 1837 and 1838 in Quebec, well, then Lower Canada and English-speaking Northern or Upper Canada, today's Ontario, Quebec, under people, Republicans by the names of William Lyon Mackenzie King and Louis Joseph Papineau. But it was short-lived. It was underripe, and it was subverted from within and from without. People like Lord John Russell, actually the great-great-great-great-grandson of the John. No, actually, never mind. But the Russell families goes back to the Venetian takeover under William of Orange, and even before that, it's part of that whole thing, hive, right? So that's a grandfather of Lord Bertrand Russell today, a leading grand strategist of the 20th century of empire. So by getting a better sense of the family compact, the oligarchical families that wanted to remain loyal to the British Empire and thus got away from the colonies in 1776 and were granted sanctuary in this part of British Canada that had just been taken over by the French after the 7 Years' War that ended in 1763. That's why we have English speakers in Canada. So these families, they became almost religiously loyal to systems of empire because they not only abandoned, but tried to destroy the American Revolution that they were once, they were once Americans, right? They were once part of the 13 colonies. And it became a weird cult, an imperial death cult, which brought in things like William of Orange's, what's called the Orange Order. It's a Masonic lodge that was created by that same guy who was installed by the Glorious Revolution in Britain, William of Orange. This cult was created as a Masonic lodge for United Empire loyalists in the Netherlands, in Ireland, in Britain, but especially in Canada, to subvert Republican movements anywhere that they might arise. And that was a big part of Canada that came in very early on.
Is that in Montreal?
It was mostly in Toronto, which is more where the Anglo imperialists were based. In Montreal, it was economically dominated by English and also Jesuitical and Anglican intelligence operatives, but the vast majority were French Canadians who lived in Montreal at the time, and thus it didn't have as fertile soil to recruit and to exist. It did become a powerful tool to suppress the good in the 19th century, but it wasn't as active as it was in Ontario. But this is what things like what William Lyon Mackenzie King dubbed the family compact, the grouping of leading families. They had sort of a Masonic order itself that used the Orange Order, but other things, and that later on was used at the end of the 19th century to be the basis of the Round Table movement and the creation of the Round Table movement in North America. People like John Perkins, a leading member of the family or the Canadian establishment, who ran the Upper Canada College, and he became the primary controller of the Rhodes Trust that oversaw the creation of things like the Council on Foreign Relations, the Rhodes Scholarship funding that brainwashed talent from around the global empire in Oxford and then redeployed these zombies back to be part of a new mercenary class of pseudo-Templars advancing the cause of British Empire and racial, ultimately depopulation. So that's sort of like our thing in Canada. And then with that mapping, I was able to then sort of revisit some of the questions of America's deep state origins and appreciate a little bit more the triple prong of the Anglo-Canadian aspect, how it interfaced with the New York, as you pointed out, those who infiltrated the Federalist Party of Hamilton, the lodges, the Cabots, the Pickerings, who then worked with the British to create the Opium Wars and the whole opium trade, and how that interfaced with the southern branch of this pincer thing of the Virginia Trust that today, in the 20th century had things like the John Crow laws that came out of the Scottish Rite Freemasonic networks that controlled the FBI, right? That ran all of these nasty operations that tried to undo the cause of Reconstruction after the Civil War. So Yeah, that's sort of the trifold idea of a deep state of North America.
Yeah, isn't that brilliant? I mean,
Yeah.
when you
I
look
never
at it
thought
like
about
that,
it.
you can see it a little better too.
Yeah.
Because obviously there's other elements involved from Europe as well,
Yeah.
right?
Oh yeah.
So
Oh, yeah.
that's an interesting aspect, both on the positive and one might say on the negative. In the positive way, out of Lincoln's time, it was literally the time where it appears the American system was starting to spread its wings across the globe. I mean, would that be a fair statement to make, that that system was actually reaching Russia at this point and reaching some of these other countries, Germany as well? And
Yeah, that's a totally fair thing. Totally fair statement to make. And I'm just looking in my book here to see if I've got a picture of it.
What page?
I do actually. If you go to page 173 of the Unfinished Symphony, might be low resolution. I'm not too sure. If it's low resolution, I do apologize. But see if you could go to 173 with a screen share to the chapter 14 called William Gilpin and the Original World Land Bridge Project.
Yes, I love this.
Yeah, it'll show people sort of viscerally what you were describing in words. Okay, that one right there. Okay, yeah, that's unfortunately it's a lower res picture than I had anticipated. Now, what you've just pointed out there, this is a map drafted in 1890 by former governor of Colorado Territory, William Gilpin, who was the personal bodyguard of Abraham Lincoln, and Lincoln appointed him to be the first governor. He was also known as the father of manifest destiny. That was what he was known as in his day. He was one of the earliest advocates back in the early 1840s for a transcontinental railway, thus to liberate the United States from dependence on British maritime controls of shipping, hence land power, right? So to become a sovereign country meant you have to be able to develop your talents, your capacities throughout the land and integrate and connect yourself so that you could thus, when you build a rail, you're not just building a rail, you're building an investment, a development corridor. You're developing now means by which, or a new system of demand by which new industrial production will be created to build the steel. New engineers are going to be created to solve the problems, to build the bridges, to bore through tunnels and other things, right? And in so doing, you're going to make discoveries along the way to things that you were ignorant of. And you will find nonlinear application of those discoveries in things you didn't expect that might involve production systems that apply to flour or other forms of production that you didn't even anticipate. That's always how this sort of thing, there's a certain nonlinearity. You're right. And that's where oligarchs who are power hungry control freaks, they get very uncomfortable with this mode of talking about reality, because they want to know everything about the future. They want to control everything. And with human systems, we're dealing with inspiring creative insights that could not be foreknown before it happens, right? And that's where this coexistence of freedom and spontaneity and law and duty have to sort of like find a mature coexistence tied where they're not seen as dualisms or polar opposites the way they're often treated today. So the Gilpin map, he commissioned this in 1890, and he had networks all over Russia, all over Asia. Unfortunately, again, I wish I could find a better. Maybe in the next video, I'll find a higher quality image, but that's okay.
She's got one.
Oh,
so
really?
she got this made up into a poster and had it print. You know what I like?
Oh, really? No way.
Yeah. You know what I like?
That's so cool.
Matt is the how it gets your mind, like if this was the map we've been looking at all as we were growing up going to school. Like when we saw a map of the world, we saw this one instead of the other one, and how that would have made our thinking so differently about the world.
Yeah, and Gilpin called this, as you see it, what he titled it was Gilpin's Economic, Just, and Correct Map of the World, with snap!
I forgot to show you this. I had this made. If I could send one to Canada, I would. Oh, the glare. It's hard.
Oh, that's gorgeous. I love it.
Oh, yeah.
Really good. Really good.
There you go.
Yes. I love it. All right.
Yeah, and what people are looking at there, those are rail lines that Gilpin had drafted all over the world, tying the new and old world through the Bering Strait rail connection. That even to this very day, it's a major battle point geopolitically around whether or not the U.S. is going to have an economic alliance of brotherhood with Eurasia, and that would be through Alaska. That was a big reason why Alaska was even sold to the Americans in the wake of the Civil War after the Russians came in saving America, was to sell Russian Alaska.
Yeah, and you
to
can
the,
see how like important each area becomes when you see it laid out like this. Like why they took advantage of the areas that they did.
Like
yeah,
why the British did, right?
Yeah.
Obviously. I mean, it's like
Yeah, it's just laid out so well. I
It's
have
so
it
beautiful.
next to the regular map of the world, and it's just interesting how they separate on the average map that you see, and to see those two next to each other, you can see where the world just like went in two different directions.
yeah, and it's really great to read Gilpin's writings, and this was being again adopted and supported by Sergei Witte, the American system economist who was the finance minister of Russia from 1890 to 1901, and then he became the first prime minister of Russia, a big reformer, huge follower of Lincoln and the Hamiltonian system. He was fighting for doing this, and that was the purpose why American engineers were brought to Russia to build the Trans-Siberian Railway under Sergei Witte, which was always designed to go all the way up to the Bering Strait and then connect, probably through a bridge, but maybe a tunnel out. Probably at the time it was a bridge, down into Alaska. And Lincoln's Transcontinental Railway was always supposed to have a branch upward north. And in fact, there was a big fight to have a northern branch that would go all the way through the northern part of the United States, and that would then connect up through British Columbia. That had a big annexation movement, which wanted to join the United States in the 1860s and 1870s, which was subverted by the assassination of one of the Canadian governors, Frederick Seymour. He was, and his murder, and I've seen a lot of evidence that indicates to me that it was a murder, gave rise to his enemies taking control of British Columbia and sucking British Columbia into Confederation, which prevented British Columbia from becoming part of this growth dynamic, and instead sucked it into this pro-British alliance. And as I pointed out in my book, like Britain had not just one, but two Confederacy operations against Lincoln's Union to undo 1776, and only one of them succeeded. That was the Northern Confederation. The Southern Confederacy movement that fortunately did fail, but the Northern one did succeed. And so that would have immediately have connected through into Alaska. And as Gilpin points out, the paradigm that would have been awoken would be a society where value was premised around win-win cooperation instead of fighting for diminishing returns. He's very clear on the two different ways of conceptualizing systems, and the British or imperialists will always impose Newtonian, because the Newtonian world presumes a fixed finiteness bounding everything. It's a closed system, which is why in the Newtonian system, as Leibniz points out, it operates like a clockwork running down that periodically requires the creator to go back in and wind the clock up, which Leibniz says, well, that's an absurd, irrational creator. He's all omnipotent and so foreseeing to have created a creation so fallible that the watchmaker has to periodically go in and rewind it. Means he's not actually all that smart. So Leibniz is like, no, if for God to exist, to be perfectly good and true, then that God must have had the foresight and power and desire to create a system that is self-perfecting, that is imbued within the self-regenerative power of creation at all times, through which God is both active as an influence, but not himself bounded by it. So it's both, because the Newtonian school and the occultists are all saying, no, you have to pick one. Either God is mundana, within the universe and bounded thus by the laws of said universe, or is supramundana, meaning outside of the universe that he created, and thus incapable of influencing the activity of what goes on in said universe, which is more the Newtonian way, that God created the laws and is incapable of necessarily intervening on the laws except by some sort of irrational desire to wind up the clock again. This is effectively the earliest framework around which the later British Royal Society operation of known as the second law of thermodynamics is brought online. And that's, again, 1870s or no, early 1860s was where you have the consideration or the imposition of this assumption that the whole universe operates just like a machine. And just like a machine is a clock or whatever, a machine has gears, has parts that work together to fulfill an operation. The energy at the start, whether it's the fuel that goes into the machine or the amount of tension you built up by winding the clock and the gears, that amount of high potential at the beginning will always wind down and diminish to the point of heat death, right? And they said, well, just like machines do it, so can we extrapolate linearly to the universe as a whole and assert that the universe operates that very same way. And thus the universe is organized by a principle of death. It's not life, but death. Whereas Gilpin, Benjamin Franklin, Hamilton, Leibniz, they're all operating under a different paradigm that life is dominant. The principle of the life force is what is driving everything as the dominant part of the dance of decay. So decay exists, but it is subservient to the higher function of life, of growth. And so for us to be happy and human, we have to also tap into our life principle, right? And that means be creative, be loving, find harmony instead of conflict. And doing things to do it in a practical way means you need to build big infrastructure so that people living in the material domain will find ways of recognizing their common what they have in common with their neighbors, right? Who they might have
humanity.
Humanity. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so Gilpin's World Land Bridge, man, like that was where everything was going in a very fast way as the American system was being applied, as you said, to France, with Sadi Carnot, the president of France, a follower of the Leibnizian Colbertist networks that had come to power in the 1890s. He was unfortunately assassinated, but he was working closely with Sergei Witte, who was part of the Leibniz network. You know, Leibniz was a guy who actually he founded the Russian Academy of Sciences. He became a privy counselor to Tsar Peter the Great. That was Leibniz. He was everywhere. And, you know, a lot of the best traditions of science, he created a whole battle plan for creating a community of internet of scientists and industrial development around the Russian Arctic that gave rise to the entire movement around which people like Dmitry Mendeleev, the discoverer of the periodic or the harmonic law organizing the periodic table of elements. That was Dmitry Mendeleev. He was a Leibnizian. He wasn't a Newtonian. He actually attacked Isaac Newton and he attacked Adam Smith's free trade. Why? Because Dmitry Mendeleev was the leader of the delegation of Russians who went to the United States at the Philadelphia Centennial Celebration in 1876. And he studied the American system of the protective tariff and brought that back to Russia, where he was the chairman of the Committee on the Protective Tariff of Russia. And you could read, I've got in my appendix of, I think it's book 1, quotes from Mendeleev himself, warning about.
Can you go into like what a protective tariff is, just in case anybody doesn't fully understand that?
Sure, yeah.
Because right there, that's right at the core of the British free trade system versus the American system of political economy.
Yeah, exactly. The protective tariff. Well, Adam Smith in the British system of economics says every nation should open their borders and have absolute free access to the global markets. And when nation states use protectionism, and I'll say what that is, it infringes people's access to the global markets. Now, the reality that Adam Smith knew, because he got his payment working for the British East India Company, which was the world's global corporation of the time, right? That's what it is, multinational global empire corporation. He knew very well that isn't true, because it only works if there's honest competition. The British East India Company doesn't do honest competition. It will always cheat, but they want to get people to play by certain rules that they control so that they could then. So protectionism is a tool that we have developed to and people like Colbert and Hamilton and Ben Franklin all advocated, which is to say, okay, well, let's use the power of the nation state, of the state of any degree, to put a tariff, a tax on cheap goods that are otherwise flooding into our markets, undercutting our local producers of, let's say, we want to make our own textiles or hats or horseshoes or our own tractors. Well, we can't do it if this multinational corporation is able to flood our markets with cheaper goods than we can sell. Like if we sell our goods, it's going to cost a certain amount of money because it costs that much to make, especially if you don't have an indigenous manufacturing base. At first, it's going to be a lot more expensive. It'll get less expensive the better you get at it. But at first, it's always going to be more expensive. So how are we going to create a situation whereby it's going to be cheaper for our citizens to buy the local thing that we need to make ourselves rather than buy it from someplace overseas that it could be done cheaper? Well, we have to make that thing become more expensive. And so the tax becomes a way to do that. Whether it's a small tax or a big tax, it can modulate it. There's no formula for success. And ideally, you want to ultimately get away from that. But it's a defensive tool, and it works really well. Every time it's done, it does create a condition which stimulates the growth of your local sector, whatever you want to build. And when people can, when the sector can start walking on its own 2 feet, then you can lower your tariffs, because it can start now actually competing with those more advanced London-controlled centers that had formerly enjoyed a monopoly. And because they've done it better, well, all of a sudden, your nation is more sovereign. It can stand on its own 2 feet economically. It's not dependent upon foreign powers. And then when you do trade with your neighboring countries, you're trading fairly. You're not just trading for the lowest price. You're trading based upon we've supplied everything we need for our people, but we've produced free energy. Well, now we could trade our excess pineapples or our excess tractors with our neighbors who will now pay a relatively just price for that production rather than having kids working in copper mines in the Congo or something like that, getting paid 25 cents a day or whatever, because their labor is being kept of low quality because they have a low standard of living. They're using very, very primitive technologies. So we could pay them very little, but the quality of their production is also very low. Their esprit, right, their spirit of inventiveness is going to be very dampened because what's their incentive to do anything better if they're just basically subsisting? So it really just crushes the psycho-spiritual and material basis upon which we exist when you live in that type of logic versus the American system, much different type of spirit. And so competition exists, but it's not based upon fighting with your neighbor. It's based on who can do something better quicker than your neighbor, and that's a healthy kind of a healthy competition that is good.
Yeah, but we all got kind of hooked by the social Darwinism and that everybody's our competition and survival of the fittest. And it just it made that type of imperialist agenda seem oh, that's the way to success.
Yeah, they cloaked it, man.
They cloaked it.
It really did. I mean, talk about
dirty
freaking Trojan horse, man. Damn.
Yeah. Because otherwise you're a commie, right? Who doesn't and that's the problem, right? So especially after during the Cold War, this got completely schizo, really, really, really bipolar, where everyone was told either you could do this thing and just be a hedonist lover of freedom, who believes in Adam Smith or the Austrian variants of Adam Smith, aka Friedrich Hayek, but it's all the same thing. Or you can be a commie follower of Marx and want to abolish private property and only want state-directed top-down controls with no personal incentive or anything. And that's your two choices. It's well, that was never the choice. That's a fake choice, and you could get that when you start looking at the origins of, well, what was the complex that Karl Marx and Engels, who is in many ways a handler of Marx, as Thomas Huxley was to Darwin, or as Samuel P. Clarke was to Newton as handlers, so too in many ways the evidence points to the fact that so too was Engels to Marx. And if you look at it, well, Engels was a deep enmeshed part of the Mazzini Young Europe operation in Europe that had created a whole new type of warfare by finding a more refined way to weaponize abused mobs of people and turned them into weapons against the states you want to disrupt from within. You know, this was done with the French Revolution. That became a bloodbath, and it was retweaked, refined in the 1840s under the young Europe, young Turk, young. I mean, you know, you had different branches of it: young Poles, young Lithuanians, young Germans, young English, young Canadians. There were two young American branches. One young American branch was tied to basically anti. It was an anti-constitutionalist movement that wanted to undo 1776, get rid of the Constitution, and create a pro-British alliance under the name of the Free States, which was what Aaron Burr and the whole Northern Conference was pushing. That was run by a guy named Ralph Waldo Emerson. Ralph, he's the founder of the Transcendentalist movement and an enemy of people like of Edgar Allan Poe and Cooper. And so that movement. And he called himself, he said, I'm Thomas Carlyle, I'm your lieutenant, as you are my master. Thomas Carlyle was one of the key figures with Mazzini, working in British intelligence, running things like the Edinburgh Review, managing this new type of epistemological warfare to detach people from their conscience and get them into their own sort of my spiritual feeling state by creating this false sort of net of spiritualism, devoid of conscience or duty. And Thomas and Emerson even wrote in Young America a pamphlet, 1837 or 1838, the idea that the Constitution is outdated. That's for old, obsolete men, and we have to go back to restore a individualist spiritualism that is more inclined with the modern times. Now, his counterpart and these transcendentalists were part of the network of abolitionists that were saying, no, let's avoid the Civil War by simply letting the South have their own separatist government, pro-British, and we'll have our own free society. Now, they never wanted to get rid of slavery. And in fact, many of these abolitionists, as Frederick Douglass himself points out in his autobiography, were themselves super racist, right? But they acted like they were these pure, virtue signaling people with clean hands, like we're the free people, we're into freedom. And free trade. They're all free traders. That was one faction of the insurgency of the North, and the Southern branch was run by the Albert Pike network of Young America South that had a different variation, a different branding to it, but ultimately with the exact same effects and consequences, with its own pseudo spiritualism tied to what you see Pike writing in Morals and Dogma, regarding the divine connection that we all have to the Creator through the Kabbalah. And again, it's all tied to the northern and southern branch of the Scottish Rite Freemasonry, because a lot of these same abolitionist networks are all also Scottish Rite Freemasons, northern branch and southern branch, all utilizing Kabbalistic modes of self-hypnotic trance induction and depatterning of the mind through certain type of techniques that you see with the Kabbalah, approach to reducing the Torah to a bunch of randomized sounds tied to incense and flames and hypnotic sort of seances you go into that are tied to, that's the way the whole thing works, right? It's a Babylonian witchcraft thing designed to deconstruct people who you need to have detached from their humanity if they're going to be trustworthy managers of a system of empire, which means they can't be in touch with their humanity. So these types of techniques are used really, really well all the time.
It's how they create psychopaths and sociopaths. Obviously, it's it's literally like a garden of it. They're just planting these kind of ideas that lead always toward debauchery and hardcore materialism. And as much as they speak of the higher, right, they're actually immersing themselves lower.
Yo, if you want a really fun story, you guys, and anybody listening to this, read Edgar Allan Poe's "How to Write a Blackwood" article. It's so funny, and he's taking aim at this fake materialism masquerading as spiritualism. He's eviscerating it, and the Blackwoods magazine was the actual transcendentalist magazine that was part of an international intelligence front operation tied to Emerson and oh man, it's so good. But yeah, How to Write a Blackwood's article by Poe.
What's the name of it again?
Let's see.
How to what? How to write a
How to
what?
Write a Blackwoods article by Edgar Allan Poe. Yeah, super good.
It might even be on your Rising Tide Foundation, the Alexandria, the Library of
Probably.
Alexandria.
Yeah, it might be.
It might be.
Probably is.
Yeah, just so everybody knows, on the Rising Tide Foundation website, they have a section called the Digital Library of Alexandria. Wonderful list of authors and statesmen and philosophers and scientists and often links to some of their original writings. So
Yeah,
it's just a
super.
really good resource for people who like to learn, like to read. I mean, that's really one of the things I think through the Campus Earth curriculum, we really want to encourage people is to read more. I mean, even when if you don't like to read the books and you're enjoying computer work more, then get Matt's PDFs. Like I love reading your PDFs, Matt, because you linked up some of your original sources, and then I go in and I find myself on trails. And 2 hours later, I'm like,
You're reading
I've read another book.
Oh,
I have another book.
he's like on the third book, like, and he left yours, and I'm like, wait, what? And he gets lost, and then he gets back to yours, and it's like,
Well, what's cool,
Fun to learn.
thanks for saying those super cool things. And like one of the fun things about looking at history this way is it's so nonlinear. You can actually lawfully jump up to our present age and jump back 200 years ago and jump back up again 80 years into the future and then jump back 2,000 years and see, because you're always looking for what are the causal principles shaping the so-called events. And the principles are the exact same principles of what was going on in ancient Athens when Athens was sliding into becoming an empire, and when the Roman Republic was sliding into becoming a Roman Empire from being a republic, killing Cicero. And Cicero's battles, it had different costumes, obviously. People weren't wearing togas in the 17th century, but it's the exact same principles of folly, of wisdom, of courage, of love of mankind, hate of mankind. It's the same principles. And so your mind finds itself more organically just bouncing around and doing it in a not too chaotic way. Generally, it gets better. At first, it's a bit chaotic.
the context to what's going on now, and to see it now, having that understanding of the history really makes it clear what's going on, who's been behind it.
Who's been behind it? Makes it more palatable.
Yeah. And the key is the future, because the key. Yeah. It's the history is about future, and it's not about the past. It's all shaped by people who had concepts of the future and conspired for good or for bad reasons to manifest their idea of what they thought the future should be, ever more perfectly into the material domain. And for the good conspiracies, I mean, it could have been better. Like, if better people were not cowardly when John F. Kennedy was killed, or didn't fall for traps that they should have known better, well, you could imagine the world would have been a lot better today. Sure. But it could have been a lot worse too, right? Like, I mean, if the oligarchy had gotten their way back in 1763 and established a one world government, which they probably would have done as far as achieving a new global Roman Empire. They'd subverted India. They got into India by the 1790s. They got into China. They'd done a really good job subverting China. They'd done a really good job subverting Africa and undoing their deeper history. So if Benjamin Franklin had not been successful, do I have any evidence to tell me that the oligarchy would not have been globally successful at achieving a new global dark age, which is what they've always wanted anyway? They just want a global dark age of perfect controls and depopulation under human talking cows. That's all they want. Would they have been successful? Yeah, probably. I don't see any evidence of something as close to what Benjamin Franklin was doing anywhere else in the world to that degree of maturity. So thank God you had people like him. And could he have done what he did had it not been for the fighters around Gottfried Leibniz? I didn't say this before. This is part of the punchline. Gottfried Leibniz almost became prime minister of Britain.
Oh, what year was that?
1714. 1714, because he was the guy who had uniquely gone through the archival work in 1701, and he demonstrated that the House of Este, which claimed to have hereditary rights to become the new crown after Queen Anne died, he proved that was a fraud that they made, that by going through the archival work. He was a historian and archivist. He proved that was a fraud, that they manufactured fake documents of their own family background, and he instead proved that it was if anybody had a claim to it, it was the Hanoverian family line that had a claim if Anne didn't have children. Now, he proved that it was embedded in the 1701 Act of Settlement that then established the Hanoverian line as what would supersede the Stuarts if Queen Anne failed to have a child. And again, poisoning, right? Didn't have a child. Now, what made this good is that his personal student, his tutor, the person whose identity he influenced more than anybody else, was Princess the Electress Sophia of Hanover. That was his personal student. And she would have thus been Queen of England upon the death of Queen Anne. Now, she's a bit old, though, but she was a full devout Leibnizian. She studied his science. She studied his metaphysics, his moral philosophy. She was brilliant. And he was her primary advisor. And so all of the networks around Robert Harley, Defoe, Jonathan Swift, they were all in collaboration and in dialogue with Leibniz. The idea was to get Leibniz into Britain. And there was a lot of operations to subvert that again and again and again. And ultimately, when Queen Anne when Sophie dies, because now Sophie dies within a week, Anne is dead. Because the only reason to keep Anne alive was to keep Sophie out. So as soon as Sophie dies, all of a sudden now it's safe to kill Anne. And who's brought in? George I of Hanover. Who's George I of Hanover? He is an inductee, a perverted little Hellfire Club loving inductee of the Bernard Mandeville cult. And he despises Leibniz. He cuts off Leibniz from all of Leibniz's promised money, pension, all of that. Nobody goes to Leibniz's funeral. Nobody. Not a single person except for Leibniz's personal assistant who's there. Everyone else is too terrified to show up at Leibniz's death in 1716. Yeah. Newton's handler, Samuel P. Clarke, because that was the period they're having this heated debate over which cosmology is true. Newton's handler, Samuel P. Clarke, writes his last letter attacking in response to Leibniz, knowing that Leibniz has died, but he does it dishonestly to try to make it seem as though for the history books that the Newtonian school got in the last word and they're right, Leibniz is wrong. And that's what they still try to sell to this very day, which is why people still are told the reason why Leibniz didn't answer was because he didn't have an answer from the Newtonian worldview, even though Leibniz had died and Clarke knew it. But despite all of that, something was created as a fire by Leibniz's remarkable work, both in Russia with Peter the Great, the reformer, who brought in a whole Leibnizian movement with the Russian Academy of Sciences. He brought it in with, he was the founder of the Prussian, the German Academy of Sciences. He was a leading figure in the French Academy of Sciences. He brought in the whole Carnot-Gaspard-Monge network of scientists that had such amazing revolutions in the Industrial Revolution. He brought in the Benjamin Franklin networks. Benjamin Franklin directly came out of this. Franklin's key teacher was a fellow named John Logan, who was an advisor to the governor of Philadelphia, William Penn. William Penn was also part of these Leibnizian networks. John Logan had the biggest library in all of the colonies in Philadelphia and was the guy who trained young Benjamin Franklin and gave Franklin full access to his libraries and helped Franklin organize his juntos. That were like his organizing groups. He didn't have a big mass-based support at the time in the 1730s and 40s, but he had to create slowly, kind of like what you guys are doing, right? Look for quality over quantity. Find people who could resonate with these higher, subtle ideas and cultivate that network of people whose judgment you could trust, who would all have the same sense of experience of discovering principles of the universe, and cultivating their identities and passions around that you could then work with, who became the front runners of the founding fathers of the American Revolution later on. So, in that sense, people could say, oh, what a tragedy that Leibniz lived his life the way he did, and he didn't get to see through any of the dreams and visions and plans that he put into motion. But really, he knew, I think he was very happy knowing that he put into motion something that would live on far beyond his death. And you look at it today, that's what is active in Russia today. That's what's come online. He also had the reason why the Chinese, Confucianism, was brought into Europe was because of Leibniz, who created the first Western newspaper called News from China, where he had correspondences with networks of missionaries in China who were becoming advisors to the Kangxi Empire The Kangxi emperor being the guy who ruled from like 1680 until 1706 or something. Same time as Leibniz, all the stuff was going down in the fight over Britain's future. He was organizing all of these networks and you could read their writings, his plan that he lays out in issue number 1 of News from China.
Like he was attempting to kind of revive the Silk Road a bit.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Leibniz's writings on China, and he's bringing about a whole program where he lays it out, calling for a Russia-China alliance around development projects that could uplift all of the people who have been abused by the empire in between, by virtue of these two ancient civilization states working together, and thus revive the sane traditions of Europe that had fallen too much into decay and corruption and needed the help of this type of dynamic. He's laying it all out, all of it. Lomonosov, who, keep rambling for a long time, but
you're
Leibniz
talking about
everywhere.
the solutions. There's so much that's still on the table, and I think that's what makes for all the depression that it can create, looking at how we've been manipulated and infiltrated. The positive aspect of that is studying these guys and all the people that were putting their ideas out there in books and sharing it with different people all over the place, like studying those renaissances in consciousness and thinking really is the starting point for where we go once this system comes down, because it is going to collapse. And so instead of getting lost in like, well, where do we start? What do we do? No, we pick up where they left off. That's exactly what we do.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, we don't have to rebuild the wheel from scratch. Like the wheel, we just forgot how to use the wheel. We've been using this friggin' square thing for a long time, and it's like, no, the wheel exists. Or you remember the movie Idiocracy?
Yes.
Yeah. It's like, maybe we should stop using Gatorade. Like, why are we using Gatorade to like cultivate all of our crop fields? It's like, well, our grandparents did it and their grandparents did it, so we're using Gatorade. And it's like, wait a minute. What if we used water? maybe that's why our droughts are going on. Maybe we're not using water. It's crazy talk.
Oh, that's so funny, man. It's interesting. Another thing that Matt lays out really well in his Clash of the Two Americas are which presidents we lost along the way because they were supporting the American system. So it is something to keep in mind. It's like we are up against something, a type of force that will eliminate and assassinate and kill people. And we don't say this to fear them, just to be aware of the sacrifices people made to promote a better system. And I think that that's something that's huge right now. Like there might be some billionaires out there that their sacrifice of their wealth to help humanity by investing. I know there's a couple of them that are definitely behind thorium and nuclear energy. Like, there's some right now, there's elites all over the world, but definitely in China, Russia, and even the States who are aware of thorium as an alternative to nuclear energy that's safe, that's completely by far surpasses any kind of solar and wind projects in terms of sustainability, what they produce. And I just think that when their energy or the energy of their money starts to go into these kind of projects, even the water project, the NAWA, the Nawapa, the one bringing the water from the BC all the way down into the southwest of the country. Like those are very viable projects. And until we get people out of their global green mindset, where they think that we're ruining the environment by bringing literally rainwater that's going to just go into the ocean and bringing it down to feed aquifers and lakes and streams and systems of life, right? So one's our systems of death, others are systems of life. One want the war and the poverty, other ones we want peace and progress and prosperity. It's so simple, eh?
Yeah, it really is. People over complexify this stuff, and it's really based in something much more healthy and simple that the mind can wrap itself around. And once it does, all of a sudden we find that we have the strength and endurance to understand things that we formerly were told are way too complex to think about, because
of course they're going to be too complex to think about if we don't have the organizing simple principle that makes it happen.
Or if you never thought about it, or you don't think about it. Like if you just don't
think about it. Yeah.
You got people that just aren't thinking. I mean,
Yeah.
we really got to start getting people thinking again and thinking that it's possible.
Yes.
Like it's even like for some people, I get it. It's possible to get a better job or to find a better way to make a living because things went south through the pandemic. Like that could be very real on a lot of people's minds. And at the same time, especially through this network and through different groups out there, there's a lot of older folks that actually do have the time. They do want to study and they do want to learn more about the history where they've been duped for most of their life by these globalization models and these really warped ways of viewing the economy or even viewing politics. I mean, certain things that, I mean, some people don't even like to talk about their money. It's like a real private matter. And some dinner tables, you can't talk religion, politics. You can't have a discussion about damn near anything. And I think that's it's real sad at a time when I feel like cultivating more true intimacy and authentic soul contact is what's going to liberate us from all this garbage. It's no brainer. Don't even matter what you believe in. Somebody could become Muslim or Jewish or Christian or spiritualist and all come to the table and break bread and be completely on the same page.
And it's so much more natural and human and organic than we're led to believe. It's like if you just give people this space and you don't have little arsonists running around in the background lighting fires and like accusing the people who are like sound or look different than us that it's them who did it. If you don't have that in the equation, we naturally tap into that mode very easily. You see with kids, different colors, different languages, put a bunch of 3-4 year olds together. They'll play with each other. They'll have fun. Mature human beings too, who have an integrated, healthy, sense of their inner innocence mixed with a bit of mature reason, which should go together, right? You shouldn't have to kill your child to become an adult. Yeah. Which is why Christ, I think, said only the children will make it into the kingdom of heaven, right? Or be wise as serpents and soft as doves, because you're entering a world of wolves in sheep's clothing. So you got to be aware of evil, but you can't be so aware that you become jaded. You have to also hold on to that innocence, that softness of a dove, right? At the same time. And if you could get better at that, then you got a key. You got a master key to find peace with your neighbors. You got to find obviously you could tap into a deeper sense of happiness than you'd otherwise imagine could have possibly have existed when we were still thinking on that lower Hobbesian order of just like me first, my pleasure, my physical pleasure, and avoid pain. Forget my kids.
It can be quite liberating just to understand that there have always been forces that have been working towards good. It's just how much of the spotlight has been put on them or not. And so for me, it makes me feel lighter knowing that like there's always been this spirit of this humanist, true nationalist movement where people wanted to provide for the general welfare and the common good. And that's never, even though they can try to ignore it and squash it and whatever, take it out of the history books, it doesn't negate the fact that these ideas have been there and have been growing and evolving over time. And it's our job to continue it on.
Matt, last night we had the pleasure to hear Dr. Sherry Tenpenny talk, and she's a forerunner on, big she's said for 23 years, she's been speaking out against the vaccination programs and what have you. So she's a heavy hitter. And she said something last night that I thought was interesting. She said, with these oligarchs and with these deep state players, we always seem like we're on the defensive. We're always reacting, and then they're doing something and we're reacting. She's like, we should use this time period right now when there's a bit of a lull in certain ways and go on the offensive. And it's interesting because when you talk about the American system and political economy and what Lyndon LaRouche was doing all those years, running for president 8 different times, he was kept bringing forth those ideas like, no, you're not going to completely bury these ideas. We refuse to allow you to do that. regardless of how big you appear to be in your wealth or in your new world order mania, because it's really more of a cult-like religion, as we know, and it is such a small group. I'm a little more, I think our bigger challenges was because of our educational system is re-educating people in some of these ideas. I think that's going to be our biggest hurdle. And
well, let's make that our next maybe the next show we do together. We could
man, that sounds like a plan, man.
brainstorm
Because I just
it
feels it feels like it's so necessary right now. Like we know we are up against it, and I think if we stay the course and we continue to speak about the solidarity, the potential for much more solidarity among
cooperation,
not only among individuals but among countries. Because obviously a lot of people out there love to talk all the geopolitics, and I love to watch it and talk. And I love to get into it like we all do. And at the same time, when it comes down to taking care of our own, like our own survival, it can also be done with joy and with a lot of heart-to-heart communication, a lot of love.
Mm-hmm.
Like our simplest actions in our day-to-day are really between our close ones and our friends and our family. So when we talk of things so big outside of us, or even in this jam that we did with Matt, talking about things so far back in history, you might think, well, what context does it have in my life right now? No, we've just expanded your mind to the reality that you are a sovereign individual down here, a soul that has some kind of purpose. And maybe some of that purpose is to get involved in something like the Rising Tide Foundation or our Alternative Education Alliance or a film project or a creative endeavor or maybe an engineering project for the young brothers and sisters out there who have a mind for engineering. We're sharing with you ideas that have been left on the shelf. It's like, hey, pick them up, you know?
Yeah. No, and on that note, you know, the difference between the Leibnizian and the Newtonian cosmology, again, is everything to do with what do you think you're looking at? Like when somebody looks at a snowflake, do they think that they're looking at some isolated little hexagon made of like water that just congealed? Or do they think that they're looking with their mind's eye at something that is a reflection in some manner of the entirety of the universe? When I look at myself, do I see just an isolated particle, you know, that's going to be dead and thus nihilistic, like what's the point in it all? Or do I see a being that can self-perfect just as the universe and its creator is animated by self-perfectibility and creative love and reason? And thus I am myself also a reflection of the entire universe as a monad. That's a Leibnizian monad. And anybody who reads his monadology, that's exactly what Leibniz is getting at, that the entire universe is composed of expressions of itself. It's at every single place in the universe. There is no place where the universe is not expressing its own yearning and impulses for self-perfectibility to varying degrees. It doesn't mean it's all equal. We're not in some like blah of all things being equal. It's not that. There are hierarchies, but just because you have a higher hierarchy, like a human being as being something higher, better, I would say, than a dog or a duck or a wolf, which is better, I would say, than a plant or a cactus, which is better than, let's say, a rock. It doesn't mean that the lower order states of being are bad, right? It doesn't mean that, which is what the Aristotelian or the Newtonian would try to say using like very, very linear logic, is like, well, if we are better than monkeys, then monkeys must be bad. So you're saying that everything must be bad. So you must be if you like technology, you must be a fan of destroying nature and paving over the earth with cement, right? And it's like, whoa, no. Because it means everything participates, if it is real and good, it participates in creation to varying degrees based upon its nature. It's not like monkeys are bad. They're perfectly good for what they are as monkeys, and they play a role within the framework of a ecosystem, which is perfect for the monkey. But you don't put the monkey in jail because the monkey killed another monkey. You put a human being in jail because the human being had something that the monkey didn't, which meant that the human should have known better and disobeyed its conscience and chose to do something other that it didn't have to do, that thus made the system bad, or made the system worse than it could have been. So, and you hope that jail is not just something about punishing, but something about rehabilitating as well, ideally, right? In a healthy system. So you get this whole It's this whole different way of thinking that, again, when you read Plato, people should just be reading, if they can, or listen to an audio book of the people who made history, who made discoveries, and see how they're writing and see if there's something common that you find in the thread of reasoning as it unfolds in a dialogue of Plato or a dialogue of Cicero or St. Augustine. Read their writings, read the Confessions of St. Augustine, read Leibniz's discourses on metaphysics, and see if there's something similar that you find unpacked as an identity and a mode of thinking about everything that is the same as what you found in Plato's Phaedo, as you find in the discourses in metaphysics, or in Kepler, or in LaRouche, and or Ben Franklin, or Hamilton, or Lincoln, or William Gilpin, and indeed you will find it. It will be there, and it's just that we have been accustomed to a form of conditioning, cultural and educational, that has deprived us of access or of a habit of pursuing the original writings and awakening that universal identity of great minds inside of ourselves. But as soon as you start doing it, you can't put that genie back in the bottle. Like all of a sudden you start tapping into that thing inside of you, and you're like, I want more of these discoveries. I want more of that, and it will be a self-feeding fire that's constantly going to self-perfect, as the universe seems to do when it is being itself and isn't having an oligarchy trying to impose artificial constraints onto the universe as a whole, like entropy or whatever else, which is just doesn't really exist. The universe doesn't abide by these laws.
You have to go.
I know.
Earlier.
We pushed you too hard.
I was just like squeezing more out.
Thank you so much, man.
Hey guys, always a pleasure.
We'll do it
All
again. Hey, have a wonderful trip going to
Yeah,
Vancouver.
that's right. Have a wonderful
Travel
time.
safe.
Absolutely.
And lots of love to Cynthia. God bless you.
Thank
both.
you. Yeah, I'll pass on the love. Thank you guys. Bye.
All right. We'll catch you next time.
Bye.
All right, ciao.